Good morning. I am Clemmer Montague, and I'm president of the James Renwick Alliance. I would like to welcome you to the Reynolds Center's Nantucket McAvoy Auditorium and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. The first thing I would like for you to do is to take this little box you have, push the little button on top. When the sign says power off, do your finger across it and power it off. Not silence it, because apparently the microphones in this building pick up the ringing when it's on silent. So please turn your cell phones, your watches, your blue phones, and anything else that makes a sound off. I want to welcome you to our lecture series of the Spring Craft Weekend of the James Renwick Alliance. For those of you who are not members, we are a nonprofit organization, and we support the American Craft Museum's Renwick Gallery. We support them by buying pieces for the acquisitions program, with exhibitions, for fellowship, and for the education programs. This program this morning is called Glorious Anniversaries, and we are celebrating three anniversaries this year. The 40th for the Renwick Gallery, the 30th for the Renwick Alliance, and the 100th for the cherry blossoms down on the mall. So therefore, the title of this program is called Japanese Influence on American Craft. And with that, we will get directly into what's going on. By the way, if you want to know what's going on in the James Renwick Alliance, or you want to join our organization, we have these quarterlies outside, our news magazine. It tells you all about what we're doing. The moderator for this program today has done everything. Gary Stevens, Spring Craft Weekend Chair, hasn't had to do anything except call him and say, will you do this? He is Halsey North from New York City, and you know how New Yorkers are. Halsey is an overseer of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He's a member of its collections committee and a member of the visiting committee of the Department of Asia, Oceania, and Africa. He and his wife Alice, who's sitting down here in front, are leading private collectors of contemporary Japanese sculptural ceramics. Since their first visit to Japan in 1986, they have visited many contemporary Japanese ceramic artists and actively collected and are still collecting their work. They have produced and coordinated 4 ceramic tours to Japan for the Japan Society of New York. Their passion for contemporary Japanese ceramics has been the focus of major exhibitions at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and the Japan Society in New York. And I think a Renwick Alliance caucus trip led by Rebecca Stevens some years ago went to see that exhibition at the Japan Society. For these exhibitions, they co-authored the catalog Contemporary Clay Japanese Ceramics for the New Century. So I present to you Halsey North.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. This is a wonderful organization, and for us, a great opportunity to work with a brilliant panel. It's just been a fabulous experience these last 2 days. Now, I'd like you to all take a big old deep breath. Just relax into your chair a little bit. Come on. If you're in the back, come on down front. We all brushed our teeth, so it's fine. You can get closer. And I want you to begin to relax, and in your mind's eye, begin to think of something Japanese. What are you thinking about? Sushi. What else? Ceramics. Cherry blossoms. How about the curve of a Shinto temple roof? A lacquer table. A golden folding screen. A tea bowl. Hello Kitty. Japan has a lot of visual vocabularies. Each in their own way have influenced American craft. But it's not just the visual influence that has impacted American craft. There's the romance factor. We're all romantics at heart. The feel and the train of thought that goes way back on the unknown craftsman. Wabi-sabi, Shinto and Buddhist beliefs, the quest for a simpler, more refined life. The influence of Japanese technique and discipline, and the particular Japanese commitment to perfection. All of these have had an influence on American craft. Today's panel members are all preeminent experts in their field, and they've all been immersed in the cross-cultural relationships between Japan and America. And they're going to talk about how Japan has influenced their work specifically and American craft in general. And we want to start with Judy. Dr. Judith Schwartz is a professor at New York University, where she directs the sculpture and craft media area of the Department of Art. Judy is an expert on artists who use clay confrontationally. Judy herself is wonderfully confrontational. Because over the past 30 years, Judy has not allowed us to be lazy in our thinking. She makes us stop and think and evaluate. She teaches us how to look. And for 30 years, she has lectured, she's published, she's done journal articles, she's done reviews, she's been a leader to make us all serious students. Judy has been the head juror to the World Ceramic Exhibition in Korea. She has been a consultant to Lenox China. She's been president of Watershed Center for Ceramic Art and served on the board of Studio Potter. Today, Judy will talk about Japanese influences that have caused a fundamental shift in American ceramics and how Japan's ceramic technology continues to inspire new ways of working with clay. I give you Dr. Judith Schwartz.
I had no idea when charged with this wonderfully stimulating topic how truly pervasive and dramatic have Japanese influences been upon this American culture. When attempting to understand and make history meaningful, I try to humanize it, and so I interviewed a number of artists who discussed their passionate experience with Japan. Their stories made my research come alive, and later I will share their insights with you. Now, I studied Japanese flower arranging in my early 20s, and I thought then, as I still do, that it is the most beautiful way to singularly express the beauty of a flower while coalescing the essence of aesthetics of art: balance, texture, asymmetry, color, form, and content. Well, these are the very key words of the Japanese aesthetic. While the depth and breadth of my research in American ceramics has focused on social and political commentary, my love of all clay objects, whether for the table, as sculpture or decorative arts, will, I hope, offer fresh insights into this vast topic and make connections to current practice. I can say with certainty that my 15 minutes can engender at most a less than superficial survey. There has always been an interest in the Orient. As far back as Marco Polo, Chinese porcelains were precious trade objects considered gifts for kings. Production secrets were much sought after as European workshops tried to discover the processes that kept porcelain rare and in high demand. The Dutch East India Company in the 17th century opened up exports from Japan, and lacquerware, porcelains, furniture, and textiles began to appear in Europe. Historically, America's decorative arts traditions were built solidly on European aesthetics. After all, We were a nation of European immigrants who brought skills and desires for what was popular and prized in the motherland. We looked to the Staffordshire potters whose slip trailing was by far the most accomplished, and stoneware salt glazes for our storage containers. We looked to Meissen in Germany for the fine Rococo ceramics, and Coalport in England for some of the highest quality painting. Or this tour de force rendering on porcelain celebrating the Crystal Palace in London and the Great Exhibition of 1861. This early expo did much to bring awareness to a growing concern about design, copyright protection, and making porcelain affordable to the masses. But when Japan was opened widely to Western commerce in the mid-1850s by Commodore Perry, Europeans as well as Americans began a love affair with all things Japanese that, with a few exceptions, has remained undimmed to this day. In fact, it was more of a mania than a love affair. In fact, the Philadelphia Centennial of 1876 installed a Japanese dwelling filled with textiles, furniture, and pottery, and was a breath of fresh air against the mass-produced Victorian goods. The public saw handmade, detailed workmanship, a new beauty, and Japanese design was a commercial success. Now, Japan, as far back as recorded history, has always been a pottery country. This map of today's potteries, these centers, has not changed much from the Neolithic era. Collectors who visited Japan brought back significant objects and established great Asian collections in such places as the Peabody in Essex, Massachusetts, and at the Sackler and Freer here in Washington. So what were they seeing? They saw Japanese interpretation of nature, motifs such as cherry blossoms and birds and frogs and insects. They looked and took particular flight in the Rookwood pottery designs in Cincinnati, which was extremely important to Maria Longsworth Nichols, the founder, who said that the Philadelphia Exposition was the source of her inspiration. The designs were captivating. Flowers, plants, fragile blossoms, and open landscapes were dramatically different, with a new spirit, and there was an exotic quality as well. Credence was given to empty space and empty areas. The void was considered as important as filled areas. The hydrangea vase that you see was pictured on a cover of a catalog at the Everson Museum in 1989, called Fragile Blossoms Enduring Earth. The curator, Barbara Perry, wrote a wonderful essay and showed examples of American artists who were influenced by Japan. And I must say, her essay was extremely helpful to me when preparing for this talk. Now, time constraints make it impossible to do justice to the Art Deco period. But because of my own collecting of this period and that of the late Howard Kotler, who introduced me to Noritake Art Deco porcelain, I must not only show you a few pieces, but show how this one manufacturer stimulated and influenced his life's work and the many that he mentored. Manufactured in Nagoya, but designed in New York City on West 23rd Street, Noritake was exported to the USA, and the Japanese gave their own imprint of the Deco style. A woman on a plate features elements from an Erte illustration that appeared in Harper's Bazaar, and the motif for the powder puff box was taken from a smoke-blowing machine that advertised Camel cigarettes on Columbus Circle. Here we see Noritake's use of stylized flowers, lusters and asymmetry, and the use of geometric shapes which characteristic of the machine age. Kotler did his ceramic study at Ohio State, and although he did his thesis in abstract expressionism, he soon became enamored with the elegant surfaces found in Noritake and turned to luster glazes and overglaze painting. Known for his dinnerware series, in this case the American Supperware, he used Japanese store-bought plates to apply satiric punning using the flag to make critical comment about America's involvement in the Vietnam War. He was influenced by and collected made-in-Japan figurines and used them to produce these large-scale appropriations. So the object on the right is approximately 2 inches high, and Kotler's version in gold luster is 3 feet high. Now, back in Japan in 1920s and 30s, ceramic artists were also in transition as industrialization threatened local craft production. It was through the joint efforts of Yanagi and Hamada and Kawai, who collectively started the Folk Art Association and encouraged a revival of traditional crafts, that the Japanese folk art, or Mingei movement, evolved. It was created to encourage the production of traditional ware and objects for daily use. These objects were direct, rustic, and simple. Bernard Leach traveled to Japan at the invitation of Yanagi. There he opened a studio and began to understand the Japanese way of seeing, pots that showed an immediacy and nature of the material. One got a sense of how the pot was formed and felt the hand of the potter. The texture of the clay with its imperfections became part of the expression. Glazes were natural and allowed to flow and form randomly, and the firings were made evident by the ash from the wood fuel that created unique and often unplanned surface patterns. Warren Mackenzie, you'll see his picture in the upper left, invited Leach along with Hamada and Yanagi to tour the United States. There have been many books and stories about this tour and how influential it became, changing the course of American ceramic aesthetic. They stopped at the Black Mountain College, the Archie Bray and Scripps, and even Greenwich House in New York. Leach lectured on culture. Hamada threw on the wheel and decorated pots, and Yanagi talked about Zen and Oriental philosophy. Their audiences numbered in the thousands, and among them were such influential teachers, such as Karen Carnes, Susan Peterson, Otto and Vivica Heino, and who in turn disseminated the new philosophy. From this came Rudy Audio, Ken Ferguson, and of course Peter Volkis, who each brought their own style and interpretation that forever changed American ceramics. It is also important to note that it was during this time that the art world shifted from Paris to New York, and abstract expressionism was a dominant force, as was Zen and meditation, and once again, the Japanese aesthetic fit right in. I remember as a student at OSU in 1960 how alarmed, well, really more threatened, my traditional faculty were by what they viewed as the sloppy clay technique. The philosophical concept of accepting the incomplete and the imperfect, known as wabi-sabi, stirred great debate, and we were encouraged to look at the more formal qualities of the Bauhaus and Scandinavian design and such people as the Natzlers and Shires and Meyer Grotel as our artist potter model of good ceramic art. But Japanese concepts were soon to permeate American ceramics at every level, where simplification of surface, integration of form and decoration, and the concept of chance became the way of working. Of course, this was best understood by Peter Voulkos. Expressionistic qualities took over formal design issues. The hand and its action upon the clay was more important than precise, carefully controlled vessels. The softness of the material was revealed, its plasticity, its thickness and textures and brushstrokes, and it appeared everywhere with fingers and thumbprints of the maker. The impact of the Japanese from California to New York appeared to be at the right moment. Zen Buddhism, calligraphy, contemplation, and the quiet passivity of Eastern philosophy played a very important role. Noguchi played a significant role as well, especially when he appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1952. What changes took place? Well, the wedging of clay became quiet and rhythmical. The tools were made with bamboo and cherry wood, and they were often made by the artists. Fred Olson built the first Bizen-style kiln, wrote the kiln book introducing wood firing to the studio potter, and the firing process seemed to change overnight. All of a sudden, anagama and raku kilns and ash and shino glazes became popular. There was a proliferation of books. Among them was Leach's The Potter's Book, which became the Bible for the American potter. The first chapter, called Toward a Standard, evoked a tsunami of thought as clay artists were influenced with every aspect of Japanese culture. Raku firing became enormously popular, with Paul Soldner doing much to make his part on the American experience. And such artists such as Wayne Higby and Jim Lorton each used their own voice to the process. Les Richter became enthralled with shino glazing, a glaze associated with the tea ceremony, characterized by that thick, very marshmallowy, unsophisticated surface, and coupled with that unpredictable effect of wood firing. In my interview with Chris Guston, he said, "It is the simple, direct movements that both the hand and the process create to establish how a pot sits in space. It's a subtle influence, not a literal one, but that's why it's so potent." Then there were those who were inspired to experience Japan firsthand. Paul Chaleff sought out a more visceral, universal connection between the culture of being a studio artist, but working there and exploring visual and philosophical ideas. I raised an issue with my interviews about the authentic or pseudo experience when I asked each artist, can Americans truly understand the culture, or are the influences superficial? Chaleff said to me, "Mine was not a simulation of Japanese aesthetic. I saw it as a choice of using a technique that already fit into my taste pattern." Jeff Shapiro represents one of those artists where the flame, smoke, and ash on wood-fired clay becomes its own aesthetic statement. In the end, he thinks it's what emerges from the fire that most counts to him. He does not care about efficiency, so his firings can last 8 days and can consume 6 cords of wood. He contends that the long firing and the ash it produces on its forms constitute its own beauty. What emerges from this sort of intense firing is truly an act of nature. Richard Milgram's aesthetic is to focus on the tea tradition. He spent 20 years in Japan apprenticing with master potters and then establishing his own studio near Kyoto, and now lives in Boston. He is one of the few Westerners whose functional work for tea strives to be authentic. Finally, just one example of the next generation. Novak uses raku firing for his, he calls the Disfigurine series, and states, Japanese ceramics never really registered on my radar, and my attraction to raku had nothing to do with its origins. I was introduced to American-style raku by other Americans. That's the next generation. Most recently, his work has taken a turn toward more streamlined and animated vocabularies inspired by manga and anime artists. It is clear that the love affair with things Japanese by Americans continues to this day, a century later. There is still a fascination and yearning for simple, more natural forms, the concern for the honesty of the material, the unpredictable aspects of process, and the combination of primitive yet sophisticated ways of working. Our world shrinks. Technology drives new avenues for exchange. But I think, as I have pointed out, cross-cultural social networking among ceramic artists is not new. It has been a tradition, and it has allowed American ceramics in America to evolve in ways we never thought possible. Thank you very much.
She has a Master's of Fine Arts from Rochester Institute of Technology, has taught at the Appalachian Center for Crafts, the California College of Art, and since 1989, she has been heading the Furniture Design and Woodworking program at San Diego State. Wendy has exhibited her work nationally and internationally with numerous shows, including New York, Tokyo, Seoul, and London. Her work is included in the permanent collections of the Victoria and Albert, the Queen Victoria Museum in Australia, the MFA Boston, go Boston, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, MAD, the Mint Museum, and the MFA Houston. Now, I have to admit, I fell in love yesterday. Wendy is incredible. She brings a tenacity and a joy and a determination to life that inspires others. And life's not been kind to Wendy. It's thrown up some hard barriers for her to overcome, like her profound deafness. But she has overcome it with a joie de vivre and a joy that is an inspiration for all of us. Wendy's talk today is about 3 different interests in her work that relate to Japanese and Asian influences. 1, she's going to talk about traditional Asia, Japan and China. 2, contemporary Japan. 3, the Japanese-American internment camps. Wendy will explore issues of her own personal identity as a Japanese-American. And it's time for you to fall in love with her as well. Wendy, welcome, and thank you for being here today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be back here after being here 2 years ago. I'm going to start off pretty much right away with my slideshow. As Halsey mentioned earlier, there are 3 layers to my investigation of Japanese influence in my work. The general crux of my work and fascination with Japanese tradition in both craft and art is rooted in kind of an investigation of my own personal identity as a Japanese American. My grandparents came over to the United States from Japan in late 1800s to early 1900s. So this path has taken several different turns in the past 15 years. My first trip to Japan came rather late in my life. I was already in my 40s with an NEA grant, which I received to live and work in Japan for 6 months. And I was kind of terrified of the idea of going to Japan because I sort of had a couple of unfortunate experiences with some Japanese woodworkers, and this is in this country, and it sort of really kind of damaged me for a while. I also came to realize what a patriarchal country Japan is, and that, I guess, that kind of instilled some fear in me. But I was happy to see that those fears were quickly dispelled once I went to Japan. Obviously, like any of you, I was taken by the beauty of traditional Japanese aesthetics in the gardens and the temples. And I also felt a tiny, tiny bit of pride in the fact that this was part of my heritage, no matter how far removed it was. Like any Westerner, I was seduced by the exoticism of Japan and its seemingly natural beauty that was bestowed on all things that were made, like the temples and the gardens, and also the craftsmanship and the workmanship with the materials that they used. Just going through some slides very quickly. When I came back from that experience, while I was in Tokyo, I took Japanese lacquer classes from Nagatoshi Onishi, who was a master lacquer artist at Tokyo Gaidai. And so I came away with a little bit of experience with Japanese lacquer, but I preferred to use lacquer in its very raw form. If you've seen Japanese lacquer, most of you may associate it with shiny black or red surfaces. I preferred the more tactile, clay-like quality that lacquer has before you buff it up and make it all shiny and black. So this is an example of my use of lacquer in the panels, which looks like ceramic in a way. Working in Japan also changed my color palette quite a bit. Most people knew my work back then as being very colorful, very, outrageously colored. And going to Japan kind of toned that back a little bit. The forms were the same, but the colors changed to a more muted tone. So you have a cabinet that opens at the center. The bench, you could sort of see some of the colors in the previous photos of the temple that I showed earlier. And then this is public seating that I did for the UC San Francisco Medical School, made from corten steel, concrete, stainless steel. Very similar to the form of the bench that you saw previously, but different materials were used. A second look at Japan. I had been to Japan many times after that initial trip. And a second look had me thinking more about the contemporary Japan and how it compared to the more traditional Japan, and specifically the connection between ukiyo-e prints from the 1800s to the current anime that is so prevalent now in contemporary Japan. And I was also interested in Japan's obsession with comics and the interpretation of women, as you can see. I don't think it changed very much. So this led to a series of what I call the Tokonoma series. The Tokonoma was a niche in a tea house that was used for contemplation, meditation, you put a flower arrangement in the corner and a squirrel. These were just my own personal interpretations of tokonoma, which were more on the absurd side. As everybody knows, Hello Kitty is everywhere, and you can buy appliances of all types with Hello Kitty, including vibrators, battery-powered, of course. My dad used to take the family to see Godzilla movies in the 60s, and so that really is embedded as part of my tradition as a Japanese American. It was the first time I saw Japanese people in the movies, too. And so I have a special affinity for Godzilla and the Screaming Woman. I started collecting these anime toys. I really do like those figurines that you can buy. And I've got a fair collection of my own. This is a close-up. These are really beautiful figurines. The arms move and the rings are adjustable. If I could only have a body like that, that would be nice. And then, of course, the cute toys. I like these. This is called Mashimaru, who is actually a Korean character with a Japanese name. Mashimaru means marshmallow in Japanese, and I don't know why he has a toilet plunger on his head, but I think that's part of his appeal, In my research and development, I've always been very obsessed, well, not obsessed, but octopus are very beautiful creatures. I don't need it myself, but, and then prints like this, I guess I was obsessed by this a little bit. And then the tea house led to some exploration in not textiles, but print for plastic laminate using a collage of different imagery. These were large panels, 4 by 10, and I did a series of them, which were then used in a tea house. I made my own little 4.5 mat tea house using wood and painted panels. And here's the interior of the tea house. And then the exterior. This is probably the biggest piece I made, and probably the last biggest piece that I'm ever going to make. It was a lot of work. But anyway, here's the detail. This is the Godzilla that you see there had been scanned on a flatbed scanner and then blown up to a 4-foot wide panel. The flea markets in Japan were some of the most incredible things to see, and I found these photos from one of the Kyoto flea markets. And I was taken by the beauty of these men who performed as women in the kabuki theaters, and decided to use them in my work, in a series of work called Men in Kimonos. And it was right around that time that I started to be inspired by Nakashima's work, which used a lot of the live edge wood in the pieces. And unfortunately, I don't know if this animation is working, but the doors slide open to reveal the woman behind. And the mirror on the left is a black mirror, which traditionally in old Japan, if you were over 40, you had to use a black lacquered mirror, which makes a lot of sense because you can't see the wrinkles as much with a black mirror. This is the piece that will be in the auction tonight. It's called the Blue Scarf. and a detail of that. This is a large print that was then put into a cabinet. And here's the final one of that series, which was put into another cabinet. And then one more. Unfortunately, the doors do open to reveal certain images in a random sense. So right now, both doors are closed, and you can't see any of the images, but those are the images. I went to Japan, and I'm in China in 2006, and that was like a whole other world too, and very beautiful, work there. At the same time, coincidentally, I was invited by the Peabody Essex Museum to participate in an exhibition called Inspired by China. So my first piece that I was researching was the vanity mirrors that I saw in China and in the collection of the museum. Started out using video in a two-way mirror so that you could see a woman putting on makeup while you're looking in the mirror. And then eventually this developed into this vanity, which was in the show, very much taken influenced by a Chinese mirror. And there's a video, you could see a picture of a woman putting on makeup. Gender and ethnicity was another layer of investigation. I did a series of sculptural pieces called the Kanzashi series. The Kanzashi is a hair comb, but these were all human size. They were 5 feet tall and various shapes and colors using wood. Different colors. I was also inspired by the signboards of the shops in Kyoto. These are much like that. And a detail of the combs. Some of the combs have paper collaged on the teeth. Identity and personal history, I started to investigate my own family history, and until recently I've avoided thinking about this because I know it's very hard on my own personal family. My mother's side of the family was in Los Angeles, and they were forced to evacuate their homes and get out of the exclusion zone. Here's a map over here. The solid line over there. If you live on the west side of that line, you had to get out of that area by a certain time. And if you couldn't get out of that area by a certain time, you were sent to the various camps that you see scattered across the United States. The triangles represent the main 10 camps, and George Nakashima and his family was sent to Minidoka. You'll be amazed at how many Japanese American artists have been sent to camp. Mira included, Kei Sakamachi and Ruth Asara. In fact, the 3 camps, Minidoka, Topaz, and Roa, will be on display at the Fuller Museum in September to honor those 3 artists. My education of the internment was nearly exclusively through photographs, and Dorothea Lange's work is especially provocative. Here are some of my early pieces addressing the internment. It was very difficult to do. It was very hard to start deciding how to depict this experience. And I started by using very simple, humble woods like pine and fir. This piece is called A Question of Loyalty. A Japanese American man had to answer these several questions, but one of which was, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? And if you answered yes, you still went to camp. And if you answered no, you went to a high security camp that was called Tule Lake. This piece is dedicated to Tule Lake. And so both there's yes and no on both sides of the cabinet. This piece is dedicated to Manzanar, utilizing photographs of Manzanar. This piece is really one of my favorite pieces, but it didn't photograph very well. But it's made out of wood from Thomas Jefferson's Monticello estate, which I thought was a perfect, material to use. I mean, the founding father of the Declaration of Independence, to be able to use that word was really special for this piece. And I started to angle the sliding doors to sort of indicate the discord of not only the difficulty of being interned, but within the Japanese community, there was a lot of discord in the camps as well. This is called USAP, Mr. Jap. It's a large panel covered with tar paper with a small video monitor that's a child height. And it plays on a loop a Popeye cartoon called USAP, Mr. Jap. It was a wartime cartoon, but I remember seeing this cartoon when I was a kid in 1955 to 1958. And I do remember singing the song, You're a sap, Mr. Jap. It was kind of an odd thing to think back on. I didn't know what I was saying at the time. These are some other pieces that are flat with objects embedded into the work. Very simple. A lot of the Japanese Americans that were interned were fishermen, and they were sent as far inland as you can imagine, away from the normal profession or environment. This is my family. The photo on the left is my mother's family before the war. My grandfather had just purchased that house, and so you could see they lived in relative comfort. And then in the photo on the right, that was taken after they were evacuated and moved to Colorado to be farmers. My biggest undertaking has been based on the tag project. You can see a lot of photos that were taken by Dorothea Lange of families wearing tags. 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned, and so I was able to, with community involvement through university colleges, churches, Buddhist temples, synagogues, elementary schools and high schools, we all managed to finish 120,000 tags and representing each person in 10 different groups. And this is the final few slides and a detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful. Donald Friedlich received his degree from RISD in 1982. He has served as president of the Society of North American Goldsmiths and earlier as chair of the editorial advisory board of Metalsmith magazine. Don's jewelry is in the permanent collection of the Smithsonian, Victoria and Albert, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, go Boston, the Corning Museum of Glass, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and others. He will be exhibiting at the Smithsonian Craft Show in April. Notice his wonderful work. It is for sale. I model well. And he also has a solo show here in Washington at Jewelers Work Gallery in September. Now, Don is a man of precision and refinement. You can see those qualities in his jewelry and his demeanor. He's been just a joy to work with over the last couple of days, and we can see how he appreciates the Japanese aesthetic, which is grounded in such rigorous discipline and skill techniques. Beginning with his time at RISD, Don was first introduced to the book of photographs of traditional packaging called How to Wrap 5 More Eggs. The art and design and architecture of Japan has been a major influence on his work, and the stunning Japanese gardens of Kyoto have been of paramount importance. Don will discuss how these sources, including Japanese gardens, the sculpture of American artist Isamu Noguchi, and traditional Japanese wrapping and packaging has shaped the development of his jewelry. Don, welcome. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the Renwick Alliance for inviting me to be on such a distinguished panel. I'm really very humbled and honored to be here. I call my lecture Things That Make My Heart Beat Faster. Artistic approaches vary widely, but I consider at least part of my approach to be one of discernment, to find the things that excite me visually, emotionally, intellectually, and then to try to understand why they excite me, and then try to bring those qualities into the jewelry that I make. Are we using this little, let's see. Does that work? There we go. Like many of you, I started out very young. And as a child, I had no interest in art whatsoever. I wanted to be Thomas Edison when I grew up. The other tough guy with the automatic weapon in this picture is my cousin Gordon, who lives in Washington. And he, for a long time, was national editor of U.S. News and World Report. His area of expertise was the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. My career went in another direction. At RISD, I studied with Jack Pripp, among others, and the German jeweler turned site-specific sculptor Klaus Burry had a great deal of influence. Dale Chihuly was my professional practices teacher, and Dale encouraged us to apply our creativity not just to our work, but to our marketing, our presentation, and our life, and it was a meaningful lesson. At RISD, I got interested in trying to bring some gesture into my work, and texturally, I was fascinated by handmade paper. I had been exposed to that during a workshop at Haystack. As Halsey mentioned, I was also exposed to the book How to Wrap 5 Eggs. I was taken by the simplicity, the directness, the sensitivity to material, and the compositions of these photographs. I began to look at Japanese gardens and photographs of Japanese gardens. I was unable to go to Japan until about 4 years ago, which was fabulous, but the photographs served as a major influence. And I started to try to bring these wrapping ideas into my jewelry. I also got interested in the idea of contrasting black and gold, and I felt like that was a very elegant combination. And these pieces are towards the end of my senior year and work with oxidized silver and gold. I found a piece of slate at RISD and started to work with it in some jewelry. And this is the beginning of what I've come to call my interference series, where I take a stable geometric form and inject some sort of interference into that stability. I also became interested in ideas of balance, and this is my favorite piece as a student and my last piece. And it's also here to illustrate the importance of quality photography, something Chihuly hammered home over and over and over again. So at this point, I've graduated in 1982, and I set two primary goals. First, I wanted to make a living at my work, and second, I wanted to continue the artistic development that I found so satisfying in school. In order to do the first, I applied to the 3 best craft shows in the country. In order to do the second, I sent portfolios to the 3 leading galleries in the country. And I was very fortunate. I was taken on by all 3 galleries, and I got into all 3 craft shows within the first year. The first show was the Smithsonian Craft Show. This was 1983, and it was its first show ever and my first show ever. So we're very much linked. And I think I'm back for 25th or 6th time, something like that, this year, next month. So before I could do any of that, I needed to do something I hadn't done for 11 years. I needed to get a haircut. I don't know if Steve Powell is here, but this was at Haystack when we were there together. So Andy Goldsworthy has also been an influence and somebody whose work I really love. And Goldsworthy said, it was very important when I discovered I could actually learn from making art. Instead of being a means of dumping my feelings or ideas, it acted as a kind of vehicle for getting information. So these are slate, gold, and titanium kind of layered together. And they're all from a slate chalkboard that I found in somebody's basement, and it turned out to be a fabulous piece of stone. I didn't know how good it was until it ran out and I tried to replace it. But I was very lucky to get a great piece of slate. I also began to travel in the American Southwest, and I was knocked out by the quality of the landscape, the forms, the color palette, and particularly the effects of erosion on the stone. And when I got home, I translated those ideas of erosion to working with a sandblaster to literally erode away the slate. And the slate is quite soft, and it just cut like butter. Noguchi said, I love the use of stone because it's the most flexible and meaning-impregnated material. The whole world is made of stone. It's nothing new. It's as old as the hills. It is our fundament. Come on. There we go. I decided I wanted to try to make my pieces both physically and visually lighter, and started to work with these negative spaces, these windows within the work. And this is the beginning of an interest in the interaction between jewelry and clothing. And the way I viewed this is the clothing that the piece is worn on became part of the composition of the jewelry, almost like a jewel set in it, and something I still work with today in various ways. After working in black for so many years, I wanted to bring color into my work. I had just enough color theory at RISD to be completely insecure about my color judgment. And the way I steered towards it was to find new materials. And at that point, very little inventive work was being done with semi-precious stone, and I thought it was an area that was ripe for exploration. Having been at RISD with some of the leading figures in the field, there were students like Howard Bentray, Stephen Weinberg, Michael Glancy, Judith Schechter, we were all there at the same time, and Chihuly, of course. I was exposed to contemporary glass and wanted to try to work with it. So Noguchi, speaking of his mentor, Brancusi, said, Brancusi, like the Japanese, would take the quintessence of nature and distill it. He taught me the truth of materials and to keep my sculptures undecorated like the Japanese house. So I had this idea for a new way to carve stone, but I didn't want to waste my stone. So I found some glass in a dumpster and set it up to sandblast it. And what I was doing was masking the material off with a perforated sheet metal. So it's a piece of steel with all these little holes in it. And I found in doing that I liked the glass as much or more than I liked the stone. And this piece was my first major museum acquisition. It was in the New Glass Review, and then Corning bought it for their collection. And it's one piece of glass over a layer of niobium. And niobium is a metal that can be anodized to different colors. You pass electrical current through it, and you set it for 40, you get blue. You set it for 50, you get pink, and 60 you get green, and the like. And you can get multiple colors in one piece, which is what I did here. And what happens with the sheet metal, the holes don't carve straight down like a drill would, they carve conically. So when I take the mask away, the deeper I go in the secondary carving, the smaller the hole gets. So I get a nice connection between surface and form. I also masked pieces off with steel screening, which is how this piece was done. So I did go back to the black onyx and to the stone, and here you can see the kind of wave pattern and the gradation I was able to achieve. I found after a while I kind of missed the slate, and after working with materials that were 7 on a hardness scale, going back to the slate was just a joy. It was soft, and it had a whole new range. I had a whole new range of processes and equipment I could use. I finally got diamond lapidary equipment, and working with the slate really was fun. My teacher, Jack Pripp, once said, if you do 10 variations on this, one of them will just purr. He was looking at a necklace of mine, which clearly did not purr. It maybe meowed, but I think it was his gentle way of saying, it kind of screeches, I don't know, not so sure. But I've always worked in series and worked through ideas in that way. And themes, as you probably can see, disappear, reoccur in a new guise. I'd always kind of resisted setting pieces from the outside, but at one point I decided to flip my framework ideas kind of on their head and to bring more open space to it. And the one on the top is still one of my favorite pieces. I love the idea of this little ring, this simple little ring just floating in space with no apparent means of how it's held in there. So, and the piece on the bottom, the glass piece, I sandblasted it and then set it over gold, and the area behind the X is left open. So the color of the X will change with the color of the clothing it's on. And it's the beginning of what I've called site-adaptive jewelry that changes with the clothing that it's on. Some pieces I did necklaces in addition to brooches, and here the neck cord is actually weed whacker line that I found in my garage. I had to sandblast it, but it was a perfect match to the frosted glass. Unfortunately, all that material is now day-glow green and orange, and it doesn't fit my aesthetic at all. So one of the other things I was interested in is that jewelry is one of the few mediums, in addition to clothing and some kinetic sculpture, that's seen in motion, and I wanted to take advantage of that. And the niobium has a very directional color quality. So as the angle of view of the piece on the top shifts, the color intensity also shifts. Graduation may be the end of your schooling, but it's just the beginning of your education. One of the great things about being an artist is that you continue to learn your entire life. I'd been a student at Haystack, twice a teaching assistant, faculty, and then I went back to take a workshop with David Watkins, the professor from the Royal College of Art in London. And he had us do a piece for a grove of trees. And at the time, it was just fun to do something and not have to make a pin back. And you know, I did this in these little saplings. I made kind of a bad Andy Goldsworthy piece, and it was great to work outside. But I didn't think it would have much impact. But when I got home to Rhode Island, I immediately started carving the slate into more organic forms and bringing some of those ideas into it. And the piece with sort of the little knothole is in the collection of the Victorian Albert right now. That was a very happy day when that happened. So I wanted to get back into the glass and started to work with textile-like imagery of carving the glass from one way from the front, the other way from the back. So there are 3 levels of transparency in these pieces. Clear, and then 1 layer of sandblasting, and then 2 layers of sandblasting. So the color of the clothing shifts in different ways because of that. I also did a little work in dichroic glass, which I normally think of as kind of a horrid material, but in small elements, I really liked it. So in 2000, I had run out of what I could do with the glass. And up until now, all the work was done cold. And most of it was float glass, window glass. So I started to go up to the studio of the Corning Museum of Glass for 1 to 4 weeks a year, taking classes from artists whose work I admired. And this had a major impact on my work. Things that were taking me days in my studio, I could do in minutes in Corning. I went from working with a little 6-inch flat lap to a 36-inch flat lap. And it was like going from driving an old Chevy to somebody giving me the keys to a Maserati. Very freeing artistically. I also was able to work with blown forms for the first time and collaborate with glass blowers, as in the piece on your right. I continue to do production work. It's also been a major part of my studio practice over the years. And in this case, I'm working with a manufacturing company in Germany that specializes in synthetic stones. So the piece on the bottom is a laboratory-grown ruby inlaid with diamonds, and the other 2 pieces are black onyx. In 2003, I was awarded a month-long artist in residence at Corning. And during the residency, I was working with a glass blower, and I had a glass blower to boss around for a month, something I recommend to everybody. It was great fun, at least for me. I'm not sure about him. And I also got to work with a master engraver named Max Erlacher. And Max has been engraving glass since he was 13 years old in Austria, and now he's well into his 70s and worked for Steuben for many years. So Max engraved the 2 concentric circles on this piece, and in the long piece, he engraved 7 identical circles in the back of this piece of Pyrex rod. And I'd cut it on a bias, so the thicker the rod got, the more wide the oval got. So this is all optical illusion based on the magnification and amplification of the glass. These are some of the blown forms that came out of the residency. So we were blowing cylinders and cutting slices out of them, and then I was cold working them extensively. The piece on your right is in the same series as the piece that's in the auction tonight. Also a blown form with a piece of gold wire inlaid or overlaid in it. Working with the blown forms totally blew the doors off of what I could do with the glass. Opened things up tremendously. And that, check my time, okay. I also did a series of pendants. These are inlaid with diamonds. So while I was an artist in residence in Australia, Canberra, I was exposed to graphite as a mold material. And I had this idea that I wanted to make jewelry that heavily magnified the clothing it was on. And again, the site adaptive ideas. And graphite seemed like the best way to do it. And so I worked with a milling machine, kind of a fancy drill press at the University of Wisconsin. And the sound overrode, there we go. I didn't film machining the actual molds, but this shows you kind of the way the machine works, just briefly. And this is very messy. It's a pencil sharpener from hell, and always done with a mask. The dust is pretty nasty. So, as you can see, the magnifying ideas worked. And here's the mold, and both the frosted piece changes tone, and the clear one magnifies heavily. You can see color makes a huge difference in these pieces. And they have this sort of glow. The back is polished, and they glow from the inside, almost like they're lit from the inside. So the next step was to work with computer-aided design and manufacturing. And this is like the other milling machine, but controlled by a computer. And this is not one of my pieces. This is something I took off of YouTube. But you can see the machine starts with a larger bit. It went up when it disappeared, automatically changed tool bits, came back down and started working more finely to refine the form. So this was another step of completely opening up what I could do. And I wanted to do a series inspired by water and the rake patterns of sand in the Zen gardens in Japan. And essentially I could do anything with no undercuts and a flat back. And it opened up these pattern ideas in a beautiful way. And still working with a blower. When I go to Corning, I often hire a blower up there. And these are also cut from blown forms. And more work using the CNC. Some pieces I fuse stock together and then heat it back up and then press mold it. So I've done a few pieces with two-part molds, and there's a very short little film clip here showing us working in the studio. I'm working here in Radiant Glass Studio in Madison, Wisconsin, and the gaffer is Shayna Live, a very good glass artist in her own right. And she's already taken one gather of glass and is going in for a second one. And the glass needs to be quite hot for the press molding, quite low in its viscosity. And so she's going into a glory hole, and in a second she'll pull the pipe out, the puntee out, and I'm on the left there. You can just see my hand. And there's a small press that I made. I took a $50 arbor press from Harbor Freight and customized it for my purposes. And normally I'm just pushing down with a flat steel paddle into the mold because they're open face, but with the two-part molds I needed the two halves to be perfectly indexed, so I needed this press. There's often a great deal of time and expense in the molds, but the hot work, as you can see, is quite quick. After the pressing, we immediately fire polish the piece. The more I can do with the torch, the less I have to do with grinding. And with a concave surface like this, it's particularly important. So Shayna's going in with a fine torch, and then I'm going to come in a second with a much larger flame to even the heat out before we go to the annealer. But I think you get the idea. There we go. So this is a better shot of what's going on with the glass. It's really like this kind of thick honey, and I think quite beautiful, huh? So these aren't press molded, these are fused pieces. And kind of, I thought of them as kind of Rothko-like. And some pieces in metal as well, these are silver and gold, using the same sort of forms. And glass over niobium, again here, with a pattern in it. So the current work, the piece I'm wearing, is done through a 3D printing process. And this is a bin of recycled glass powder and essentially an inkjet head dispensing a binder, an organic binder. And it builds up layer by layer like a topographic map. You can see the sort of footprints starting to emerge in the back of this printer. The piece is then taken to an oven and baked to solidify the binder. This is a lower temperature thing, more like 300 or 400. And after that, it's submerged in high-tech sand. And the sand provides enough support structure, but also allows for the very major shrinkage that happens when it's fired. So it's brought up to fusing temperature, the binder burns out, and the glass fuses together. So it's like a computer-driven pâte de verre process, and the aesthetic is very much like pâte de verre. So this is the green state. He's taking out the excess powder. It's still quite fragile, cleaning it off with a sandblast, delicate sandblasting, or perhaps an air hose, more likely. And this is a sand, which is tiny little spheres, and then it's fired. This is not my design, but it shows you what comes out of it. And it has quite a few limitations. So this is what I'm doing with it. The piece on the top is the one I'm wearing, and the others are CAD renderings of other designs I'm working on. So I lived in Rhode Island for many years, and my wife and I bought the oldest house in the state. It was built in 1677. The National Historic Registry lists the architecture type as post-medieval. I'd never heard of that period before we bought the house. But for the last 12 years, we've been living in the Midwest in Madison, Wisconsin. This is my home and studio up top, which is an oversized garage that I renovated. Inside the studio, all my obsessiveness that Halsey mentioned is taken up in the work. The studio is always a train wreck. My adorable little dog, Josie. So this piece is called Necklace for an Insecure Man. When I served as SNAG president, I took the job very seriously, but I don't take titles very seriously. So SNAG had a fashion show, and I thought I'd have a little fun. So this is my final little sentiment. The world is shaped by the activists, those that take the time to be involved, to do the work. So many of you have done that to the benefit of the Renwick and craft in general, and our panelists have certainly done that as well. I encourage you to continue. This is how the field moves forward. Thank you.
He's a leader in our field. Jack, as much as anyone else, has been preeminent in our field as our Keep talking about it. Let's hope he comes back. Jack has played a leadership role in the American Craft Council, American Craft Museum, and many of America's museums with a craft emphasis. He's always been there when the field needed him. As our advocate, as our spokesperson, as our champion, as our cheerleader, Jack has always been where the crafts needed him. Jack formed the company that bears his name in 1952. And as a textile designer, revolutionized how America thinks about textiles, how business uses textiles, and how they think about fabric. He is one of only 4 living Americans to have a show at the Louvre. Jack has been to Japan 39 times, and he will talk to us today about how Japan has influenced his work, his life, and his lifestyle and his outlook on life. Yesterday, Jack introduced himself as a gardener and a weaver. And here at Longhouse Reserve, he's created a slice of heaven to showcase both of those talents. I introduce you to Jack Lenor Larsen.
Good morning, friends. This is Longhouse. We've spent the whole last year spending $500,000 making it better, with everything improved, including the gardens. And on Sofa Weekend, we will introduce a show called Accumulations Now, 500 works in craft media in our collections from the last 100 years. We expect you to come. I grew up a very long time ago in the post-war Northwest, in and around Seattle, Washington. And when I was introduced to art and architecture, we felt far from Europe and even far from America's East Coast. We felt close to Japan, to Asia, but particularly to Japan. Our professors had either studied there or lectured there or were born there. Our artists like Mark Tobey and Morris Graves had learned their art in Japan. aesthetically related to Japan was our Northwest School of Architecture. And even though the war was just over, we felt very friendly to these people who had such remarkable taste. We also liked Japanese foods like teriyaki, and our lifestyle was influenced as we became Japanophiles. The ceramics, however, in the post-war years that we talked about and admired were Chinese, and particularly their glazes were beginning to be used by American potters. And the exception were low-fire, brilliant pots influenced by Glenn Lukens in California. But by 1950, brown stoneware, Japanese influence had dominated American ceramics. This is largely through not Japan, but through Bernard Leach's instructions and particularly his books. Not long after that, Bernard himself, and accompanied by Hamada, toured through America twice and talked to many of our incoming potters and their collectors, and the Japanese influence was certainly on. Also, the imports from post-war Japan tended to be in craft media. They weren't geared up for their own revival, let alone exporting at that time. So we saw wonderful textiles and particularly tableware handmade by Japanese potters. Then came the MoMA house in the garden, totally Japanese, built by Japanese, and national influence from that, and how beautiful and clear and rational it all was, and understated. There was also a influence indirectly from Japan that had come through Japanism. 19th century focus on Japan that influenced the arts of Europe in particular, and that was a ricochet in America. It affected arts and craft movement, in particular in America and as well as Europe, and it also influenced the post-war, the post-impressionist painters and their new sense of perspective, and in turn influence us here. The minimalism of Japan fitted our post-war houses, which no longer aped manor houses of Europe, but were small, compact, with lots of good new appliances, and they were without servants. I met Mark Tobey in Seattle, and he said, "Oh, I've never met a weaver before, but I did know two potters." And these were Bernard Leach and Hamada, who had been with him for 2 years in Japan. And I never quite understood the adulation of Hamada's work. The post-war, it was turned out by the 2,000 pieces. They were mostly small and brown and done by assistants. And then I saw his two retrospectives, his two memorial shows in Japan, in Tokyo and Kyoto, and it was his pre-war work, which was large and magnificent and individual, and he was indeed a great potter and a tremendous influence on the ceramic world worldwide. Then came, at Fiberworks in San Francisco, a marvelous show and classes done by Yoshiko Wada, just here from Japan, hardly knowing English, but she taught resists, shibori in particularly, which we then called tie-dye, and ikat, the tying and dyeing of yarn before it was woven, and liquid resists, or batik, and usually indigo dyed. And among her students were Catherine and Ed Rossbach. And Ed was the greatest weaver in America. And his influence, his enthusiasm for a whole new field of study, and Catherine's even more so, as she worked in resists and decorating fabric rather than creating it. And they influenced the world with this enthusiasm for resist patterning, all coming out of Japan. Art fabrics came late to Japan. I had bolstered them in the late 60s and 70s, and we were much involved with the Lausanne Tapestry Biennales and so forth. That didn't get to Asia and Japan either for a very much later period. In fact, it was probably, according to Nishi Ranai, the two books, Art Fabrics, that got to Japan and were translated and were printed in resist fabrics for that market, and what did have an interest there, and is still going on. Art fabrics here are sort of a dormant. We've moved beyond them pretty much in the West, but Japanese are still making them, and sometimes very well. From the 1980s on, the whole world was influenced by the innovation of the genius of our time, Junichi Arai, who did all sorts of new things with fabrics, particularly with woven fabrics, a genius in the area of jacquard patterning. And he had other tricks. He boiled wool, and he got it to shrink and seem handicrafted, even though it was made on a machine loom. He designed for Issey Miyake and Kenzo and the early Japanese fashion modernists, and did marvelous things. He taught in Europe and America and had many students in Japan, and it has revolutionized the way we think of fabric since. There have been Japanese exhibitions here, and very good ones. And as the Japanese think so highly of art, they spend some money on those shows they send abroad and to world's fairs. And that's influenced us a lot. Then there's Japanese food. When I came to New York, there was one Japanese restaurant, and now there are thousands, and there are all over the world. And Japanese gardens, their preeminence has influenced us in all areas. Their films, and particularly those post-war ones, like The Gates of Hell, the samurai films, showed us something quite different. And though Japan is a long ways away, it was 36 hours in 1959 from Honolulu to fly to Japan. It's only about 12 now. It seems relatively fast. It's closer than the rest of Asia. And as China was closed until very recently, and not comfortable for tourists, many of us have gotten to Japan. Longhouse has been there many times with Yoshiko Wada. We're going again in 2013. And it only gets better. The difference is that Kyoto in 1959 was heaven. It had not been touched by modernity or by the war. It was a medieval city, and it was full of artists. And it has suffered terribly in being modernized without thought, without a concern for what is precious there. And only the gardens are pretty well untouched. There's still wonderful people in Kyoto. But what is marvelous are the great new cities like Tokyo, which would came up out of the ashes. We totally burned that city, and they rebuilt. They built cheaply to begin with, and it was the transportation and the smog were terrible. Now there is no pollution in Tokyo, and each year the buildings become better because their land is so precious. They tear down 20-year-old buildings and build better new ones. It is the first great city of the 21st century. Hong Kong is just behind. This is where it's at. If I were young, I would certainly be living in the near Far East. It's where things are going to change. Gertrude Stein wrote a small book at the end of her life called Bruzy and Willie. And these are two GIs in France after the World War II. And they have these discussions together. And Bruzy says to Willie, "You know that America is the oldest country in the world?" And Willie said, "What makes you think that?" And he said, "Because we entered the 20th century first. We invented telegraphs and telephones and department stores and mass production and all those things, high-rise buildings that made the 20th century. And America did it first. And we did it because we were trying so hard to catch up with Europe that we passed them by momentarily. And the same thing has happened in Japan and the near Far East. They are zooming ahead of us. It's a wonderful place to be. Make sure you get there soon, but come to Longhouse. Thank you.
I'd like another round of applause for the panel. I think they did a great job here. Marvelous, marvelous. Let us take just a few minutes for question and answers. We're running just a little late, but it's been worth it. It's been wonderful. But do y'all have any questions for each other at this point in time? Nothing. Judith, what do you think is more important in terms of the impact on American craft? Japanese design influence, the visual vocabulary, or Japanese craft techniques and processes?
You know, it's hard to separate those two. I think, you know, there was always, as I saw it in the aesthetic of the artists here, everyone pays attention to a specific part of your personality that brings out what you're interested in. And when you think about technique, there are some artists who just get fully engaged with glazing. And for example, the Les Richter pieces that I showed you. Not only was he involved with Shino, but he actually wrote a book called American Shino, The Glaze of 1,000 Faces. And he just focuses on the glaze because he just finds that serendipitous nature of the glaze so exciting. And then when I think about Japanese style and design, then I have to say that a person like Jun Kaneko, who deals with pattern and surface and scale, those are very important things, and that has influenced American ceramics enormously. Jun Kaneko is a genius when it comes to reinterpreting Japanese pattern and as I said, brought the scale. So I really think that it's different strokes for different folks, and as long as the influence brings out the highest quality of work, that's the most interesting thing, you know, that you see the best of the glazing or you see the best of scale, and as these artists interpret it.
Jack?
What has not been mentioned today is the enormous influence of Toshiko Takaezu, who was born of Okinawan parents in Hawaii.
True. And
studied at Cranbrook, and herself taught and lectured and juried all of her life until she died last year.
Right.
And She influenced weavers as well as potters, a remarkable artist and an enormous influence.
It's true, and her sense of glazing was spectacular. Her spirit, she called her forms those spirit forms, and she did bring out that kind of spirit. And her scale was quite amazing. It's true.
She was great in metal as well. Some of
As
her metal
well.
casting was
Right.
fabulous.
There are just so many artists, you know, it's like in 15 minutes, how do you cover them all?
Right. Don, you talked a little bit about the specific influences of Japan on your work, but in the terms of the broader field of American jewelry and metalsmithing, what do you feel that are the broader influences of Japan in the field?
I'm going to represent glass a little bit as well. And in both metals and glass, I don't think there was nearly as much influence as there was in textiles and ceramics. I think it's safe to say, while there's some great Japanese glass going on, the U.S. was much more influential in Japanese glass and the world's glass than the other way around. In metals, the most prominent influence were from Jean and Oroko Pijanowski. They brought the process of moke megane, which is wood grain metal, laminating process related to Damascus steel. They brought that to the United States in the late 1970s. And it was very popular for a period, and there are some practitioners that continue to use it, but it's sort of fallen off. It's part of the vocabulary of American metals. Most, undergraduate and graduate programs teach it, but there are not that many people using it. There are also, and I think the strongest influence on American metal, if I'm looking to Asia, is from Korea. There's been much more exchange of people. There's been a constant stream of grad students coming over from Korea, particularly women, often getting a second MFA in the United States, many of them staying. There are some prominent Japanese-American practitioners that have had quite a bit of influence. Reiko Ishiyama, for one, Sayumi Yakuguchi, and April Higashi, and quite a few others. But there are many more Korean metals people than there are Japanese.
Interesting. Wendy, how do you think American craft has changed because of the influence of Japan? Changed.
Well, if I were to touch on the influence of Japanese, Japan on American craft, it certainly has set the standard for technical excellence, especially in woodworking. The techniques of Japanese carpentry is so refined, even almost more so than European cabinet making, for instance. And I think the complexity of the way they use the materials versus the simple outcome is phenomenal too, because for all the work that goes into a piece, the outcome is very simple and very wabi-sabi, and that's very hard to do. I think Americans try to emulate that, but I think the outcome is that they tend to try too hard. Don't you think?
Tries a little too hard.
It's, and I know I've tried too hard. and I know that I could never pass myself off as being a truly Japanese-inspired artist. I'm perfectly happy to be identified as an American artist, Japanese-American artist, but I hope to bring to the table a little bit of the Asian influence as well as the personal history. And as far, did you say in the future? Okay. It sort of depends, because Japan has gone through a catastrophic event with the tsunamis, and I would be very interested to see how they may interpret their experiences through their work, as Americans have when they've gone through 9/11. It would be interesting to see what kind of changes come about in terms of artists and the dialogue with their materials.
That'll be interesting to see. That'll be interesting to see. Jack, what aspects of Japanese culture do you believe have had the greatest influence on American craft?
First, to finish up with Wendy, the best gallery for fine American crafted furniture in America is in East Hampton. It's called Pritnam and Eames, and their new show, the best work there is Wendy's new work.
Oh, thank you.
We should commission a bus and go up.
I think our idea of Japanese taste is the strongest influence. We often misidentify it. When I was a student, we painted everything white, thinking it was Japanese, and the Japanese don't know what white is. But their sense of refinement, of understatement, of shibui, that to various degrees we sense it, and it influences what all of us are doing. And it's pervasive in Japan. The reason they're also thin is that they live on flavor and ornament. The way a plate looks when it's served to you is more important than what's on it. But this is, from one level to another, it still is very important there. And our perception of that has influenced all of us for a very long time, and for the better.
Very well said, very well said. We have time for one or two questions before they give us the hook. Any questions out here, any pressing questions? Someone down? Oh, yeah, hi.
Dr. Shapiro showed the map of Japan with all of the pottery sites that you mentioned go back to Neolithic times. And pottery is the one craft medium that seems to be so identified as Japanese. But yet, you all come from a wide variety of media, and even in Japan, media other than ceramics are used. So, is ceramics as all pervasive as it seems to be when looking from the West, or is there a wider variety?
Is ceramics as all pervasive in Japan as we seem to think it is looking from the West? Is that actually a life influence in Japan? Let me take that one. Yes, it is. And it is for a couple of reasons. For one thing, ceramics in Japan is among, if not the highest art form. And it's because of the tea ceremony and the reverence that the Japanese historically have brought to ceramic objects as part of that tea ceremony. Ceramics were one of the great gifts that the daimyo could give to the shogun or to each other. And ceramics as trade gifts was very important in the hierarchy of the political structure in Japan. Also, because of Japanese food and the way they eat, there are many, many small dishes on the table. And the dishes become very important. And as Jack was saying, how you select those dishes, how they're arranged, the season of the year determines what dishware you use. The kinds of things you eat are determined seasonally, and you have to have the proper dishes for them. So every Japanese home had bountiful plenty of dishes of different kinds. And it became very, very important. And things like refrigeration and storage and preservation all had to do with ceramics and how they kept things. And then the tokonoma, Wendy talked about the tokonoma. Quite often there was always a ceramic piece, a flower vase of some kind in a tokonoma. And so those things became very, very important. And so historically, throughout the history of Japan, ceramics has been critical. Other responses to that?
Yeah.
Ladies first.
Okay. No, I was going to say, I mean, I brought a Japanese artist who specialized in Orabe to New York University to work with some of my students, and he wanted to, to reinforce what Halsey is saying, he wanted to introduce Orabe when they had the show at the Met. Remember the wonderful Orabe show at the Met? And he got my students to make plates, and then we went to a French restaurant and seduced the chef to allow us to serve his meals on our Orabe plates. And Japanese television came and taped it. And the French chef really learned something. You know, he really began to appreciate what the plate could do to a table and to the food. And I thought that blending of East to West was just wonderful. And it brought attention to Orabe, but it also enlightened, I think, the chef to how glaze can affect food and the shape of a plate. And when you go to, in Korean food even, and Japanese, you look at the table, I always pity the poor housewife that has to wash all those dishes, because there's so many different kinds of shapes that go with each aspect of the meal. And so there's so much more ceramic at the table than any, I mean, I worked for Lenox China, you know, you had your dinner plate, you know, and you had your salad plate. But in a Japanese table, you have 40 different plates for every aspect.
Jack?
In Korea, you are given a large tray, depending on your wealth, with all of the plates on, and you eat from one to the other, from hot to cold, to smooth to rough, and so on. In Japan, they come in sequence, and whereas American middle class has tried for a very long time to get every plate from beginning to end to match, theirs do not. I was at one festive dinner where there were more plates than usual and much better. And I remarked so to my host, and he said, I hate to say this, but the plates you ate off tonight are worth $500,000.
Yeah. Makes a big difference. Sounds like a great meal. They're giving me a signal in the back, so I want to say thank you all very much for coming. Let's thank the panel here.
Thank you, Jack. Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you all.
You only go for